Hey there, folks. This is Jay Frost, of course, at the Philanthropy Mastermind series. It's a pleasure to welcome you back. And of course, to welcome you to what I think is going to be not only special because it only happens once every 4 years. That's of course, a leap year program. But more importantly, it's a program that I think is going to challenge you in a good way, much like it's challenging me, both because the content we're going to be discussing will be delving into some areas that were put off for a long time in our sector and are going to be explored in a degree of depth that we don't normally have an opportunity and privilege to do, but also because it gives us a path forward with maybe some new ways to talk about those things. And so it's really a pleasure to do that. But before I jump into it, I want to welcome all of you and encourage you to make use of course, the chat and the Q&A as you see fit. This should not be just me talking to our guest today, but it should be you and your questions and ideas that form the fabric of this conversation. So as much as you want to be a part of it, please do. I may even throw some questions at you, and our guest may as well. But before that, maybe you could just let us know where you're tuning in from, maybe which organization, which part of the country. That would be really, really helpful to our guest to see who's in the room with us. So if you wouldn't mind, we'd love it if you'd open up a chat and just say hello. That would be really, really awesome. And while we're doing that, I also want to encourage you to take a look after the session today. And thank you for starting. Kennerly, Ellen, Megan, this is great. Lori, Janine, Anne, Chrissy. Oh, this is really great. Thank you. Thank you all for doing that. Please keep it up. And we can see that you're here from everywhere, from Georgia and Minnesota, Pennsylvania, straight across the country. Maybe we even have some people from overseas. We often do. And we have people both from, of course, the side of the sector we'll be discussing, which is the nonprofits who are often seeking support, as well as the people on more the grant making front. And we'll be tweaking those terminologies as we dive into here today. But it's really great to see all that and to see the names of your organizations. Thank you for contributing there. Please keep your fingers warm. We want you to be a part of this, since we can't literally see or hear you. This is our one way of hearing from you. One more way that you can engage with us will be actually at the conclusion of the presentation and discussion today. You'll see there's a little QR code where you can engage with us. You can always reach out to me. I'll provide my contact information. Of course, we'll get our guests as well. And you can see a library of all of our content over at that of our sponsor, DonorSearch. And that's available at DonorSearch.net under the resources tab, where you'll see literally hundreds of programs, much like this one, consisting of webcasts, webinars for CFRE credit, and of course our podcast series, all of that's available to you there and on their YouTube channel. So I just threw a lot at you as we were beginning, but I want to, of course, welcome Liza Mueller here, our guest. And Liza, do say hello if you would.
Hi, everyone.
It's good to see you, and thank you very much for being here today. And for those who don't know you or your work, of course, you're the VP of Thought Leadership and Knowledge at Echoing Green, and we're going to talk a bit about Echoing Green as well as this massive report that you all have authored, and we'll be dealing with that in depth in just a minute. I have to say that the idea of having a person here whose specific job title is thought leadership is a really wonderful thing, because there's a lot of talk about everything from ninjas and gurus in the sector, but actually deciding we're going to bury ourselves in the ideas and give them a lot of heat and light is really refreshing. So thank you very much for making time to do that with us, and to do that both with us today, but also more broadly at Echoing Green. Maybe I could ask, if you don't mind, to start with just talking a bit about Echoing Green and your work there.
Sure, yeah. And Jay, thank you so much for having me on the podcast or the webcast. We were actually chatting a little bit last night, and I was listening to some of the other episodes. I'm a fan. I've learned a lot from the episodes that I've listened to, and I just really appreciate you having us on. Like you said, my name is Liza Mueller. I'm the Vice President of Thought Leadership and Knowledge at Echoing Green. And it's funny that you say that my title is thought leader, because I sort of actively resist it. It's thought leadership, because I don't want to be seen as like trying to hold on to like I am a thought leader. But thought leadership at Echoing Green means trying to figure out and be really intentional about what the organization is learning. And it all started, like my first job at Echoing Green was to fix Salesforce. But that turned into, you fix Salesforce for what? You fix it so that you can do your work and hopefully so you can learn something. And then how are you using those learnings? How are you using those learnings internally? How are you using those learnings to inform like the space that you're in? And then kind of at the end of my trajectory here and how I ended up with this title is, how do you use those learnings to influence others, to share some of your values, and to move the field forward in a way that it's in alignment with what you've learned over the course of doing your work. So I have been with Echoing Green for 14 years at this point. But Echoing Green has been around for the last 35 years, investing in very early stage social entrepreneurs and social innovators who are really looking to challenge the status quo in terms of how social change happens. They're deploying very innovative ideas for solving some of the world's biggest problems in their communities where they're very proximate to both the issue and to the community that is seeking support to better the lives of their community and the sustainability of the environment in their community. We were joking that Echoing Green is often a kind of a well-kept secret. It's often an organization that folks have heard of, but may not know the detail of what we do. And really, we are in many ways sort of an intermediary between grant makers and some of these very early stage leaders. We aggregate philanthropic capital that we raise from various funders, whether it's corporations, foundations, individuals, and then we re-grant those funds to early stage social entrepreneurs in the form of a fellowship program that we run. So right now we're funding about 40 new leaders every year, and our support of them goes far beyond the check. So it's an 18-month fellowship, but you're also, once you're an Echoing Green Fellow, you're a fellow for life. And so it's a lifelong community and support program that's intended to not only drive forward the solution that they have proposed, but also sustain them to be in the social impact and in the social innovation space for their lives. We just heard from an Echoing Green Fellow from the early 2000s the other day, who we'd not spoken to in a while, and she shared that she's still in sort of weekly contact with some of her fellows from her cohort, and is still sort of talking about her Echoing Green experience to people in ways that has really transformed her life. So some of our best known fellows are folks like Michelle Obama. When she was on the founding team of Public Allies in Chicago. Public health leaders like Dr. Raj Panjabi, who was key to, supporting Liberia during the Ebola crisis. But then folks who are also well-known, like public figures like Van Jones. We funded Teach for America and City Year when they were first getting started. So you've definitely heard of some of our fellows, even if you haven't heard of us.
Yeah, and I can imagine that that intermediary role that you described, some people may see that as a hurdle, but it sounds like the opposite. I mean, it sounds like a way for people to find access to the resources they need, not just this year with one grant, but as you say, for a lifetime of collaboration with other people in this kind of thought leadership space.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, we're trying to do away with some of the stigma that the word intermediary sometimes comes with it. I think sometimes people think of philanthropic intermediaries as unnecessary or wasteful or a drain. We're proud of the fact that a very significant percentage of the funding that we raise goes back out the door in grants. And we try to make that like as efficient as possible. But we are also cognizant of, so just to give you a sense, for some of those examples, right, the folks that I just mentioned who have received the Echoing Green Fellowship over the years, they came to us with an idea. So Echoing Green funds people. We are a people first funder. People come to us saying, I have an idea for my community. I can use my skills and knowledge and ideas to advance a solution to this problem. And so oftentimes, it's at the idea stage. It is maybe not yet registered as a legal entity. We fund globally, so not everything that we fund is a 501c3. And so we're so early that we're often someone's first kind of major grant or financial resource that they're able to get for their organization, for their idea. And that means that their ability to access funding through more traditional vehicles, like applying for just a cold open call grant application from another funder, would not be very successful, often not very successful at that stage. The amount of resources that are out there for stuff that is at that sort of very nascent idea phase where really the individual needs money to pay themselves and to start seeding and building a foundation for the solution. And so what we find is that what we're doing is we're building the pipeline of future leaders for many other grant makers. And the partnerships that we have with some funders are exactly that. So they're coming to us saying, we want to fund new ideas. We want to fund things kind of in these areas. We want to fund emerging concepts, emerging solutions. We don't have the capacity to do it at the scale and at the stage of the organizations you do. So we'll partner with you, and with using our funding, will you fund, let's say 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 fellows in this area to build the pipeline for the folks that we might invest in 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now. And we love those kind of partnerships because it's really very intentionally seeking and supporting the individuals that we believe will make really substantial transformational change on systems that are oppressing and marginalizing some of our fellow citizens.
Right. And well, fellow citizens of the world, it sounds like too, because you are a global
global citizen.
Yes. But being in this role of funder and of grant partner, we're going to talk about the terminology in a second, as opposed to beneficiary or recipient or that kind of thing that people often use. It must also give you an opportunity to do two things. One is to constantly rethink the model and to keep improving on it, which is wonderful. I mean, that's what we should all be doing. But it must also mean that you have seen change within Echoing Green itself over time. Do you mind just touching on that for a minute? Because I think you alluded to it before we began today. Over 14 years, Echoing Green itself must have evolved from the Michelle Obama era to what you're doing today.
Yeah. And I'll go all the way back to 1987, and I promise it'll be fast. But Echoing Green was founded in 1987 by a group of individuals who had connections to General Atlantic, which is a growth equity firm. And this included a name that some of you might be familiar with, Chuck Feeney. So Chuck Feeney was the inventor of duty-free shopping. He amassed quite a bit of wealth, and he was one of the first people to kind of publicly name that he intended to grant all of his wealth philanthropically before his death. Chuck Feeney passed away not that long ago, having succeeded at that goal. And folks like Bill Gates name him as an inspiration, for example, for the Giving Pledge. And so at that time, Chuck and the other partners, they really saw an opportunity to leverage what they had learned in the traditional investment field around, a great idea is a great idea, but if it has the right founder, the right entrepreneur, and if you can give that individual the right kind of support, you can be exponentially more successful because you've tied the two together. You've tied the sort of really high potential individual with the really high potential idea. And they saw an opportunity to do that for the social sector as well. And so it really started as them iterating on what they had been doing in the business world for the social sector. They had a couple different versions of starting a grant making program and a fellowship program. And what it turned into is really what we still do today, which is a fellowship program that provides capital in the form of a grant, capacity building support. So how do we support someone in building their leadership development capacity, and a community. So we really invest a lot in building out the community amongst our fellows, both in cohorts as we select them, but also with the community as a whole. And today there's nearly 1,000 fellows in that community.
Oh, wow.
And so they built this sort of foundation for us. But in 2002, Chuck Feeney, he changed his philanthropic strategy. And in order to achieve his goal of spending down his wealth, he needed to sort of spread it out differently. And so Echoing Green made the decision, all the partners decided that we were going to transition to a nonprofit. And we were going to have a little more independence, that we were going to leverage the philanthropic world differently, to hopefully bring more capital into the leaders that we were supporting. And so you fast forward to today, and Echoing Green has steadily grown since 2002. But as it has grown, as it has grown into its own, I was telling you earlier, I think we've been able to live our values even more strongly. So Dr. Cheryl Dorsey is our founder. She's a social entrepreneur herself. She received the Echoing Green Fellowship in 1992. And as a Black woman in this field, who was on the early side of self-identifying as a social innovator and a social entrepreneur, she has seen how philanthropy and how really the social sector has often overlooked the potential of so many leaders, so much talent, but in particular, proximate leaders, those who are members of and/or have very tight ties to the communities that they're serving. And so her having this experience, both running her own organization, operating Echoing Green for so many years, all of that learning and those observations about how the field could be more inclusive have been increasingly built into the model that Echoing Green runs. And so today we're sort of known as an organization that funds a very diverse cohorts of leaders. And that's not just geographically or issue-based, but it's also demographically in just about all the ways that you can imagine.
That's such an important note, because if somebody were looking at this with the sound off and without subtitles, they would see two people who don't necessarily represent the pool of individuals who've benefited from this kind of investment in social entrepreneurs and social innovators. It's been highly diverse, and not just on a US context. I'm so glad you put it, you gave us those examples, because often I think Americans will think in terms of what it's like here, and including what diversity means here. And that's important, but it's only one small piece of a big planet, and lots of different needs and interests and experiences. There was something else that you said in there that was interesting, and maybe it came even before, about it was before we started today, about the goal of ending systemic oppression,
Mhm.
which is, I know, embedded in the values of the organization itself. It may even be within the mission statement. I don't have the mission statement in front of me. But it is clearly the goal. So as we talk in a minute about this report, The Weight of Power, the reason I'm prefacing it this way is this isn't new for Echoing Green to be addressing this issue. So it's not like in the middle of the pandemic with racial reckoning, which is a chief component of this report, kind of discussing that. It wasn't like, well, let's do it too. This is something that you've been working on as an organization for years, and then you addressed it through the context of this report. Is that about right? Am I summarizing correctly?
Yeah, we have always had a very, diverse portfolio of leaders that we're supporting. But I would say starting in the, early aughts, we really started to take a much closer look at not only who was applying for the fellowship, because it's important to note that it's an open call. So anyone from anywhere in the world can apply. We have very limited eligibility criteria that are mostly, legal and technical eligibility criteria. We started taking a really close look at not only who was applying, but who was making it through the process. And we started thinking about sort of in what ways does our process reinforce a meritocracy or reinforce elitism, right? And how can we dismantle some of that in our process so that we're selecting the best talent, not the talent that looks the best on paper, or looks the best in the ways that a society that is often driven by white supremacy might see it. And so what we sort of started to do as we were dismantling that is that we also started to lean into creating partnerships where we knew that there were gaps in what kinds of leaders doing what work were getting support. And so in the early 2010s, there was a movement around Black male achievement. So what does it look like to improve the life outcomes of Black men and boys in the United States? And when President Obama came into office, this was a thing that he talked about frequently. He invested, government support in sort of building out this field. And Echoing Green partnered with Open Society Foundation to start the first fellowship program to support emerging leaders in the BMA space, BMA meaning Black Male Achievement. And we ran that program for 8 years, despite only having dedicated funding for it for the first 2. So we ran it for the additional 6 years using general operating funds, because we knew and we saw in those first 2 years how much demand there was for this capital, because there was not enough philanthropic capital going to early stage leaders in that space. And we saw how important the work that we were doing in building cohorts and communities of those leaders was to the movement as a whole. And so, when you think about how we've been talking about ending systemic oppression for so long, I think we really believe that social innovation is the constructive force, like not destructive force, the constructive force for change that can drive sort of massive and sustained positive impact in new ways faster than other approaches. And that doesn't mean that there won't be social innovation failures. Like part of innovation is acknowledging that certain times things won't work out the way you intended and that you might need to pivot and iterate and innovate. But we do believe that if we had all of the right solutions already, we would be further along in solving some of the systemic oppression issues that we see and are just like so in our face today. And so rather than continue to try to use some of the same tactics to solve problems, we have to be continually introducing new ones and investing in the ones that are already working.
Yeah, you'll have to remind me, even though we didn't discuss this as we prepared today, towards the end, you might have thoughts, or Echoing Green may be trying to think about what the potential implications are of the Supreme Court discussion of this issue, or the issue that will come before the court with respect to whether or not philanthropic investments may be specific to by demography and that debate. Because
oh no, I seem to have lost Jay. if you all in the audience can hear me, I'm still the one on the call. Thank you, Sarah. I believe what Jay was talking about and what he was starting to ask was about the Fearless Fund lawsuit. So the Fearless Fund is a program that had a specific grant-making program that was supporting, I believe it was Black female entrepreneurs. And this program was challenged in the courts by an organization that said that this was racially exclusive. So sort of using some of the laws that exist to protect and support systemically marginalized communities to accessing programs and services, using them in the flip to say that this program was racially exclusive. That challenge was upheld by the courts, and it is very likely that it will be taken up by the Supreme Court for evaluation in a future session. And Echoing Green has been watching this really carefully, and we think that it sets an incredibly dangerous precedent for organizations that have for a long time and are newly committed to supporting work that is being done by, and I keep using this term proximate, and I guess I'll keep I'll keep defining it, but leaders who are members of and identify as members of the communities they serve. And Echoing Green does not have eligibility criteria that are based on race. We believe that we're selecting leaders based on their potential as leaders, not based on their demographics. But given that we are so focused on supporting proximate leaders and supporting leaders who are doing work in some of the communities that have been most deeply affected by systemic oppression, that means that a large percentage of our cohorts do identify as people of color or from Indigenous communities. So we're watching this very closely. We think it's a very dangerous precedent to set. We're disappointed in the courts at the decision they made, and we challenge our peers, as well as philanthropic institutions, to really double down on the ways in which they're thinking about supporting leaders of color, and then particularly programs that are looking at how you support leaders of color to advance racial equity and justice. There's a great article in Chronicle of Philanthropy from last week with Lori Villarosa from PRI on it, that's calling for the same thing. And Echoing Green is going to be sharing out that article as well, because it articulates really well the ways in which we think funders should be showing up at the moment. Okay. Jack says, just got a note from Jay saying he's trying to get back in the webinar. Okay. Well, I hope Jay can make it back. Jack, do you think that I should just talk a little bit about the report that Jay was alluding to early on in the call, which is where sort of the conversation about me coming on today started?
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So Jay and I originally got introduced because Echoing Green last fall published a report called The Weight of Power, which is all about the ways in which metrics and evaluation impact access to capital for BIPOC social innovators. So social innovators that identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. And when we published this report, we started talking to various media outlets and podcasts about ways in which we'd like to talk about it and share this report. And Jay was gracious enough to invite us on to talk about it. And I'll just give a little bit of background that's related to the ways in which I've described Echoing Green's trajectory. Being this philanthropic intermediary, being an organization that supports very early stage social innovators, social entrepreneurs, when we really started doing that in earnest, and when we transitioned to a nonprofit, that was still a very new model. It's more common today. I wouldn't say it is common, but it's more common today than it was then, but it was a new model. And so when funders would come to us and were interested in supporting the work we were doing, we would often get through a funding conversation and then end up at the point of like, okay, how are we going to measure the success of this grant? And we would often get shuttled into either funding portfolios or into ways of measuring the work that we were doing that often just didn't make sense. So as an example, you hear that we support entrepreneurship, and one of the most common metrics that folks measure when you're doing an entrepreneurship program is jobs created. But if you think about our model and that we fund people first and that we fund very, very early stage leaders and that we're funding social innovation organizations that may or may not need large teams, growth in jobs or growth in jobs created wasn't something that we were trying to do, nor was it necessarily the best measure of success for the program. And so we found ourselves oftentimes measuring things that didn't make sense. And hi, Jay.
Hi. I'm so sorry about that. That's a
okay.
first. Yes,
That's
when
okay.
you talk about constantly iterating and improving, this is one of those days for me.
Innovation.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Liza, for being so patient.
No.
It sounds like you two were enjoying the conversation. Where were you?
So I finished out the answer to the last question and then just asked Jack if I should just jump into talking about the report that is
Please.
how you invited us on today. So I was just describing Echoing Green's experience in measuring our work in partnership with grant makers. And talking about how oftentimes nonprofits, and I imagine a number of the attendees in the audience have experienced this, are sort of handed measures for their work from a funder that may or may not make sense or may not have meaning for the way in which you're doing the work or for the community you're serving. So is using that as an entry point to say, we're not alone, you're not alone in that experience. And what we have additionally observed from our 35 plus years of supporting these very early stage innovators who are doing work that doesn't necessarily fit the mold of work that's been done before, doesn't necessarily have a evidence base in the same way that some funders might expect, and might be being done by and done with communities who have had perhaps negative experiences with social progress programs kind of coming in, parachuting into their neighborhoods or to their communities and doing things in a way that just didn't make sense for them and the way that they are organized, their culture, or the way that they connect with one another. So in observing the experiences of our fellows, we really, started to see patterns around who was able to access funding, who was able to measure their work in a way that would lead to a renewal or an increase or an expansion of the partnership that would enable them to have more resources. And we really started to see that oftentimes leaders of color who were sort of seeking some of these grants were being locked out in many ways. And some of you might be familiar with some of Echoing Green's other research work from several years ago, where we did a study that found that Black nonprofit and leaders in the United States are able to access significantly less philanthropic capital than their white counterparts. And so this research that we published last fall really sort of built out of all these experiences, the other research that we've done, and we really wanted to talk to both social innovators and funders about their experiences in the way that they require, use, leverage metrics and evaluation. So I'll pause there since I asked my own question.
And I can't see any questions that had come up before, but I'm sure you answered those. This is where you were jumping into the weight of power and the origins of the report. I'm wondering, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves too much, and if you address this while I was away, I apologize. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is also the weight of words. And there were choices that you made in delivering this report that are pretty unique, and I alluded to them earlier, right? You talked about, you talked about proximate leaders for one thing. You've already addressed that, what that means. You talked about the difference, or we talked briefly about the difference between beneficiaries and something like a partner. Can you talk a little bit about the intentionality of the language that you're using as kind of a vehicle to give us more agency in this?
Yeah. I'll just say language is something that Echoing Green thinks about a lot. Like we're very intentional and think very deeply about some of the terms that we use. And when we were developing this report, and I have to shout out our research partners from MPHI. We worked with just like a really incredible group of women who really helped us interrogate not only the research questions that we were asking, but also the terms that we were using. And there's actually a page in the report of definitions, both terms that we've chosen to use and terms that we've chosen not to use. And the three that we've chosen not to use, the first is stakeholder. So stakeholder in particular is problematic for many Indigenous communities in the North American context. And, they're, rather than saying that someone owns a stake, which is often problematic, it's thinking about how someone has rights and titles. And so we prefer sort of a strengths-based framing of that. Another one is grant recipient. So we've replaced grant recipient or grantee with grant partner, because we believe that really what's behind a lot of the sort of foundational values of a lot of philanthropic institutions is wanting to partner with those who are doing social change work, nonprofit work, what was in sort of in the past might have been referred to as charity work, although we don't use that term either. We really believe that philanthropic institutions or philanthropists and those doing the work should consider themselves partners, not necessarily sort of those that have the resources and those who are receiving them. And the last one is capacity building. Talking about capacity is great, but talking about capacity building sort of has the notion that the person who's providing capacity building support is conferring something upon the other party, as opposed to, in the same way, partnering with them to build more capacity for the organization. And so those are some of the terms that we've chosen not to use in this report.
Right. And I'm sure that was as much in gathering the information as it was in delivering it. So it wasn't just a way of dressing this up to fit a narrative, but rather it was a set of thoughts that guided the development.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is really important, and I'm sure instructive for all of us as we think about these things. There, can you again, if you didn't do this already, can you talk briefly about who you covered, like where you gathered all the information, how many people were involved in those who were, let's say, interviewed or surveyed, and then maybe some of the key findings?
Yeah, we surveyed over 400 grant makers and grant partners, as well as interviewed, I believe it was about 25, sort of in-depth interviews with folks from those same constituencies, and in doing that, we sort of evolved some of our research questions. But some of the key findings were that we heard time and time again from both sides that funders have significant power to determine which metrics grant partners use to measure success. And so as a result, grant partners collect metrics in service to funders' needs, which are not always the same as the needs of the communities where the work is actually happening and being done. Just in terms of some numbers, sort of 87% of grant partners who are part of the communities they support report using metrics for accountability to funders. And that's not as surprising when one sort of understands that you're using the ways in which you measure the success of your work to talk about, enter into conversations, and then hold yourself accountable to using the funding effectively. But in reality, when you think about especially the demographic dynamics there, when you think about these individuals who are members of the communities they serve, but then you look at the demographics of parts of the philanthropic sector, 86% of CEOs and 69% of full-time foundation staff are white. So you start to see how there might be some insight, knowledge, and awareness gaps between those two parties, as well as some power dynamics that might not lead to fully transparent conversations about when things are and are not making sense for the grant partners. When we ask folks, when we ask especially the social innovators, what some of their top challenges were, the lack of data infrastructure and evaluation staff came up overwhelmingly as one of the biggest challenges that BIPOC leaders face and associate with social impact measurement. And we know, and I'm looking to the attendees here too to share some of their experiences, but resources to support data and evaluation and measurement are some of the hardest dollars to get because it's seen as something that you should have as a product of doing the work, and that's going to support you in doing the work, but it's not always something that kind of rises to the top in terms of something you can get support for. And what we end with really in the report is what are some of the strategies that can be used to create more equitable funding streams. And it's some of the things that you've heard before from initiatives like the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, for example, but it's providing multi-year flexible funding. It's streamlining reporting processes, not asking for metrics or data that's not going to be used. It's increasing funding for BIPOC leaders because we know that there's a huge disparity there. And then offering sort of technical and financial support for data collection and management initiatives. Because if what you're aiming to do is support the organization to sort of grow its foundation and its capacity to do its work, and especially if you as a philanthropic institution are requiring like a quantitative evaluation of what's happening, really supporting that effort is paramount.
Yeah, and we had a comment from Charles in the chat while you were talking about it's not just my organization struggling with data.
No.
It's, in a word, no. In fact, that might be interesting as a way of gathering just some insights from the crowd here, if that's also your experience. So
yes.
If we'd love to know whether or not that's true for you as well. And this isn't just a matter of whether or not you've gathered the data, I guess, which is its own set of complexities. But there's also the place where you house and manipulate the data. There's a cost to that as well as a human cost. So technology as well as people. And then, so design, gathering the tech, and then finally, there's the issue, which I know was embedded in that part of the report, which is that just because you are thinking that these are the things that are important, and they are, because these are the leaders, the proximate leaders you've been discussing, who are closest to the action. They're trying to, work with the community, make good things happen. That's not necessarily what the funder has been thinking that they evaluate based upon. So those are the major findings, but what does it mean in the end as you're trying to help organizations then take this report and find a way to, I don't know, get people to start talking in a way that's productive about what information can we gather that makes sense for the organization that does inform the funders so they can do better work too. So they're really in a true partnership.
Yeah. When we first started this report, we knew that our primary audience was going to be the funding community. And we knew that we wanted to talk about this issue and some of the barriers that the way in which the philanthropic sector leverages metrics and data were hampering some of the progress that we believe that they believe in. we really wanted to talk about it a different way. So we actually started with a literature review, which is like, not something we normally do, but we went out and we said, okay, what are people already saying about this issue? And where are some of the holes? And some of the holes were in not just saying this is a problem and not just sort of leaping to maybe logical, but inadequate solutions around, for example, creating highly standardized metric sets. I'm not saying that all metric sets are bad. I'm not saying that all of that sort of infrastructure is not good for the sectors, because there are places where it absolutely is, and it makes the work for both philanthropic institutions and nonprofits more efficient. But particularly when you get to some of the more nuanced work, when you get to how you're measuring perhaps an innovative approach to a solution, when you are measuring work that's being done in communities that have been systemically oppressed and marginalized, and perhaps overstudied in ways that were inappropriate for their culture and the way in which that community functions. We wanted to talk about it in a way that sort of dug under what we saw as some of more of the root cause issues. So, and really what that boiled down to was talking about power and talking about the ways in which power is often centralized in philanthropic institutions, and that power is often not shared with those grant partners in a way that would help both parties achieve the goals that they've set out to achieve. And so as we were, talking to funders, talking to grant partners, as we were writing it, we realized that really what we also wanted to do is we wanted to write this as a validation of so many of the experiences that we've heard from our fellows, and that I'm seeing sort of in the questions in the chat, people echoing. I'm not the only person that has problems with data. I'm not the only person who's struggling to find strategies and approaches to shift power to proximate leaders. I'm not the only right? We wanted to validate so much of what we were hearing. And we also wanted to provide some context and tools to open up new kinds of conversations between grant partners and some of the philanthropic community to have different kinds of communications about this issue. So one of the things that we will often coach our fellows and talk to them about is not only how does one define what success is, and a lot of our encouragement is for them to involve their communities in helping them to shape that vision and to shape data measurement, and objectives that make sense and that are meaningful to the community, but then coach them in terms of how they can start to have conversations about why their measures might be different than the other nonprofit down the street, or why their measures might be different than the nonprofit that operates in that city across the country where the context is very different, or why that metric might be different than what the government program that's trying to solve a similar issue in the community uses to say, this is how great this is going. And that's one of the things that is challenging for early stage leaders, is challenging for proximate leaders that may not have the kind of rapport with funders that's required to have some of those difficult conversations. But that's why we're encouraging folks on both sides to enter into conversations like that to advance this conversation to a level where we're actually building new ways of working together.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. And I know you've cited a couple of the questions in the comments just in the course of doing that. We do have a couple here that they're more logistical in nature. And one is about a recording. And yes, if you will stay tuned to your email, we send out a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to the recording. So you can be on the watch for that. We'll also have within that a link to the report, but we can include the report link as well. In fact, Liza just did that. So thank you. So you can see that right in the chat. And I would encourage you to read it. It's a great report, but also to share it, because the point being, if I'm listening to you carefully, that this isn't a set of instructions, it's observations and analysis to help us have conversations that are informed. maybe with a common language, but not one that's restrictive. So as you just said, here are different ways you can think about measurement, but now it has to work for you.
Yeah.
The real challenge is then talking with the people who might provide some access to resources, but they also probably have their own internal needs and metrics. And so we have to have a conversation or else
Yeah.
nothing happens.
Yeah.
I have to ask you kind of a big one, which I know is a hard one to answer. But there are various views as to whether or not the very public commitment that was made by many grantors, especially at the height of the pandemic, and the racial reckoning, whether or not has been maintained or not. And I know that's not the focus of the report necessarily, but I wonder if you're hearing that as you discuss these issues, and whether or not maybe this report and the kinds of work that you do at Echoing Green provides us a way to maintain that momentum and interest and focus on those issues.
Yeah. You know, when the call dropped earlier, the question you had sort of left me with was a little bit about the Supreme Court and how some of the decisions that have been made are impacting, you know, our work in the field. And I sort of gave some context around the Fearless Fund and kind of how dangerous we think some of the judicial work that's being done right now is to not only the pledges that were made in 2020 after the racial reckoning, but in general, what needs to be a sustained commitment to ending racial injustice and oppression. And, you know, I think what we saw in 2020 in terms of financial commitments was unprecedented, depending on, you know, whose report, whether you read, you know, McKinsey or Candid or the New York Times or JP Morgan, it's anywhere between 16 and over $300 billion, right, that was committed to racial equity and justice. And when you slice that, you know, there was a lot of that funding that was about, you know, creating new products and services, that was about moving funds, for example, to Black asset managers and the way they were going to be managed in creating new loan programs, things like that. There were a lot of that money. And then there was the philanthropic capital, which, you know, we often will use the sort of 16 or 60 billion, depending on whose number you use again, number. And I think we don't have the receipts, really. We don't know how much of that money has actually gone out the door, has actually gone to racial equity and racial justice focused organizations and work. We do know that it has been slow to go out, and we're hyper aware of the way that the backlash on woke capitalism, on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives is then even further slowing, ending, or sort of erasing some of those commitments right now. And you know, we are very committed to our focus on racial equity and justice. We often talk about it in terms of ending systemic oppression, because we believe that you know, a global perspective on anti-Blackness in many ways is the foundation of much systemic oppression. And we, you know, like what we saw in some of the articles that are coming out in Chronicle Philanthropy last week, about calling for funders to really double down on funding racial equity and justice programs is what we really need right now. But I think we are seeing a backslide. It's not surprising. This is what happens. The sort of emphasis on supporting racial equity and justice comes in waves, but it's by no means what we want to be seeing, and it's, you know, incredibly disappointing and disheartening.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know it's a tough question. It's also one that, as you said, different people measure these things in different ways, but as long as the discussion continues and we have data and analysis like this to support that discussion, it's helpful. We do have some other great questions here, so maybe we can tackle those. One came in from Charles talking about, because you referenced Mackenzie Scott and yield giving, this trust-based philanthropy movement. What, if any, positives can be taken from those approaches to leverage unrestricted gifts without reporting requirements? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. We actually list several sort of initiatives and programs in the appendix that we would love to send people to, and trust-based philanthropy is one of those. There are 6 strategies are wonderful ways, and there are ways in which nonprofits can read those and leverage those in the ways that they start and continue and have conversations with funders that I think can echo those principles that funders are hearing in their own professional networks. But we were very thankful to be early recipients of Mackenzie Scott's funding in 2020. And have been astonished by the amount of funding that she has distributed, and the inspiration that she has given to others in terms of the way that that she is doing unrestricted funding. We call on more funders to take that kind of approach. We call on philanthropic institutions to distribute capital in ways that is much more flexible and friendly to the ways that nonprofits sort of need to leverage capital and cash flow. And we continue to be a part of the conversation of the impact of Mackenzie Scott's grants. We actually are participants in several studies that are looking at the ways in which her early investments and ongoing investments are changing the sector.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're focusing rightly a lot on what she's doing and the impact it's having. But as you began this conversation, you talked about Charles Feeney and this big and that commitment to giving. We do have a kind of a short attention span or historical reference point for these things. There have been a lot of people who have made impacts in their own ways. Some quite also quite good. Liz had asked this question about whether or not Echoing Green partners with other intermediary types of entities as a multiplier, so you can pass along the strategy learnings to other grant makers that you work with or that others work with. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we do. So we are a part of the social innovation community, and there are a number of intermediaries in the social innovation space that do work similar to Echoing Green, and it ranges from organizations like Ashoka and New Profit, but then also the Skoll Foundation for a number of years had a program to support building out a more equitable intermediary space, and we were fortunate to connect with many of our peers through that. And actually, there's a really great example of us doing this next week for anyone who might be attending, especially anybody in the education space who might be attending South by Southwest EDU. We're actually on a panel. My colleague Daniel Stein-Sales is on a panel there with 4 other philanthropic intermediaries, all of which run application processes. And we're actually collaborating with them to look at what a much more streamlined, almost getting to Common App way of taking in grant applications, what the future of that could look like. So when you share the recording, I'll put a link to that session in the share out.
Oh, that's wonderful. I mean, that's what I was thinking of as you said it was a common application, which is that's fantastic. Are you seeing a lot of interest in the part of grant makers in this? I would think it would be beneficial to them. They can work their own metrics if they insist on the background, but it's based on a common set of data, which makes it, of course, easier for the applicants.
Yeah, there are a lot of initiatives like this, and I actually want to call out another one. Candid has a Demographics by Candid program, which is newer and it's emerging. And the thing about all of these sort of common programs is that it just takes a lot of time, because every organization has invested in their own system, their own data, their own framework. They got their old data that they want to link the new data to. And so what we're doing is, with a small group of partners, trying to shape what could it look like, so that you get folks starting to maybe disinvest a little bit in their sort of dedication to the way that they've always done things, and begin that sort of change management process to what could a future look like that could potentially be better, but the change part is hard. So I think we do have interest, but it's still quite small, and it's a small group that's trying to move the conversation forward.
2 quick follow-ups on that, because that's really, really important practical knowledge for all of us in this room and beyond. And one is that those kinds of technology platforms, once we can get people to stop just making it all proprietary, the benefit is so great, because it helps us all to submit. the skepticism arises when those of us who have been on those platforms know they usually start for free and then suddenly there's a fee. Submittable is an example of this for writers, right? Where
Yeah.
if you submit a poem somewhere, great, it's easy, it's free. Well, now it's $3 per pop. And
Yeah.
so if you're a
Yeah.
poet, you submit a lot before you get published. So is it the same kind of thing in these platforms, or are they being underwritten by the funders so that
That's
these
what
are
needs to
also
be
free
happening.
platforms?
That underwriting is what needs to be happening, because I
Okay.
think that, those with resources should be the ones who are building out the plumbing of the field. Like you think about
Right.
it, in many ways, the social sector is lacking some of the common infrastructure that other fields, other sectors have. And if we could be investing in that in smart ways that are for the mutual benefit of a large swath of the members of these sectors, then I think that that could really move things forward. But the submittable example is a great one. Like we wouldn't want to move towards that. We would want to move towards a place where it's being underwritten by those with the resources.
Right, and that's not to knock submittable.
No, not at all.
We
Not at
all
all.
want to
Everybody needs a
submit our.
business model.
Yeah, it's just another way of doing things. But then the follow-up to that is on the back end. So one of the chief complaints, Voulet has mentioned this a lot. He's made it very funny, but it's also very serious. Has to do with reporting requirements. And we haven't talked a lot about that today, at least while I was here with you. And I'm wondering if that's something also that might be addressed by these common platforms.
I think, yes. I mean, I think there are platforms out there that funders are starting to adopt that have some common infrastructure, often across grant makers that nonprofits are using. One of the, I think, issues right now is that, number one, a lot of those platforms funnel funders towards quote unquote common metric sets, which then often, in
Right.
some ways can be helpful, because a nonprofit could say, okay, these 3 grants that I have are all pulling from the same metric sets and are asking me the same questions. That's great. But those platforms often don't leave the room or make it difficult to then customize or to extend into what not just the nonprofit, but the community members that are partnered with these nonprofits who are looking for these products and services, what they are calling for are and what they are defining as success. And so we're missing so much of the nuance when you commonize. And so it's a double-edged sword, and it's not something that's easy. It's not something this report has like an easy answer to. What we're doing is trying to have more of the conversation about it and move that conversation forward.
So where does this take Echoing Green and your work, frankly, there? I mean, because you've opened a door to some really important discussions, and this one we're talking about right now has this most direct impact to everybody in this room, which is that on the one hand, the efficiency is increasing and it's making things accessible, but on the other hand, sometimes those efficiencies create exclusions. And that's the very basis of this, was to eliminate those exclusions, create more opportunity for organizations that really serve people at the front lines and have their own way of measuring. So as you look forward and think about future reports, but also future impacts Echoing Green wishes to make, where do you see yourselves going?
So number one is we have an unwavering commitment to continuing to support and fund early stage proximate leaders. And that includes an emphasis on racial equity. So like that's number one. And by doing that, we want to continue to not only advocate for better support for those leaders, but also share our learnings that sort of we've gleaned from running these grant making programs, from running these support programs, from learning about what some of their most salient challenges are today, even as we go through waves of support and retrenchment for them with the field, right? So that's number one. And number two, that leads us to Echoing Green is really thinking a lot about the field of social innovation specifically, and the way in which it's underdeveloped. And so we're partnered with the Skoll Foundation, with Ashoka, with Common Impact, with New Profit. We're starting an emerging conversation with them about what are the needs of the field, where we could not be advocating just as Echoing Green on behalf of our fellows, but we're advocating on behalf of the field of social innovation for change in the way that philanthropy, government, the corporate sector, and the social sector work together to deploy and support more innovative solutions to some of our biggest problems.
So 14 years on, it sounds like your enthusiasm hasn't waned. If anything, it's grown. Do you think this is a better environment for this work now than
Yeah,
before?
I'm all in.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I've been at this organization a long time, joking that I've worked for 5 different Echoing Greens, and I feel like the 6th is on the horizon because, we've been very, very fortunate, and are very, very grateful to our supporters these last few years in helping us grow. And I am really excited and inspired by the commitments that this organization continues to make to advancing racial equity in a time when that is increasingly not the easiest thing to do.
Thank you so much for all this, Liza. Really do appreciate it. If people want to follow more of you as well as the work of Echoing Green, what's the best way for them to do it?
So we, on all platforms, are Echoing Green, and our website is echoinggreen.org. We're very active on LinkedIn, and we do a lot of sharing of not only our own work, but also the work of our fellows. But you can also find us at various conferences upcoming, including South by Southwest, and I believe our president, Cheryl Dorsey, is also going to be at TED this year. So.
Wow. Well, that'll be a video to watch. Thank you for all of that. We'll make sure that some of those notes are also included in the notes for this recording, which you will be able to find on DonorSearch's YouTube channel coming up probably in the next 2 to 3 days. And I really do encourage you to go and grab that report. We'll also include a link in that email that's coming to you in the next 24 or so hours. So with that, thank you all for hanging out, putting up with the technical interruption. I'm happy to be a second Jack Frost here. Gratitude to Jack for maintaining things while I was away, and Liza for being so gracious, both for everything you shared today and for putting up with that hurdle. Really do appreciate your being here.
Thank you so much.
And everybody, do join us again next week. We have 2 more programs coming up. And you can see recordings of this and all those programs, both present and past, over at the DonorSearch channel at donorsearch.net. We'll look forward to seeing you there and seeing you next week. Till then, take care.